All right, thank you. I don't know if we have the PowerPoint available to share.
Yes, I will share right now.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think it's officially 12 o'clock, so we can say good afternoon. And thank you for joining us during your lunchtime today to listen in on this long-awaited AB 1491 presentation. As we get this presentation up and loaded, we'll be going over the agenda and just covering what our focus for today will be on AB 1491. And next slide, please. So for today's presentation, we'll be doing some introductions and we'll be focusing on AB 1491 overview. My partner, Neil, will be focusing on AB 1491 member carryover, and then I'll transition off to cover the AB 1491 consortia carryover. We have support from our Kate Tapp and Veronica, who will be assisting us with covering information on our tools that we will be deploying and have available for tracking on this AB 1491 legislation. We'll go over a timeline, and at the end, we will open it up for questions. Next slide, please. So to kick this off, as you all may already know, my name is Mayra Diaz. I am the program lead with the Chancellor's Office, and I have with me today Neil and Veronica. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Neil Kelly from Department of Education.
Veronica Parker, coordinator with the CAP Technical Assistance Project. Good afternoon, everyone.
Awesome, thank you. Next slide, please. So to kick this off, we'll be providing an overview of really what we'll be engaging on and talking about for the next hour and a half, which is the impacts of Education Code 84901 and 84914, which is our AB 1491 legislation. So to highlight a few important aspects to what we will be talking about today, tracking for this AB 1491 carryover is officially going to begin with fiscal year or program year 23-24. This update to the legislation addresses actions related to carryover of funds from a previous fiscal year to the next. There are two main aspects to this carryover legislation that can impact members and consortia differently. On the member side, members will vote to set a carryover percentage threshold within their consortia. Also, members' funding for 1 year may be impacted after 2 years are assessed if they are found to have excessive carryover. At the consortia level, which is what I will be referring to as that second tier level that we will be monitoring, if consortia exceed 20% carryover annually, they will be monitored by the Chancellor's Office and the California Department of Education. So for any consortia that does exceed that 20% carryover annually, they will be required to submit a written expenditure plan and will be assigned technical assistance by both agencies. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Neil.
All right. Thanks, Mayra. For those of you who are old enough to remember the members only jacket, we're going to go into the member carryover. So with that, I don't have my members only jacket, but I probably have it in the closet. But anyway, next slide, please. All right. So let's just wanted to stay up front. You know, before this legislation, we did have a few consortia that had carryover bylaws. And so your consortia could have done this all along as long as you had member agreement. And so remember that when we go through 1491, for member carryover, you still have to get member agreement. So nothing's really changed there. The legislation does put some guidance and some parameters around that. So how's that, Veronica? Is that better? I'll get closer to the...
Yeah, your speaker is moving from your headset, and so it's obstructing your sound.
Okay, I'm talking into a laptop. So is that better? Or maybe it's
a little.
That's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll get a little closer. All right, so like I said, the new legislation just puts parameters around that, but this is something you already could have been doing. In fact, we did have a few consortia that were already doing that. So let's look at the legislation for members. It says AB 1491 would authorize a consortia to reduce a member's allocation by no more than the amount of the member's carryover. So it authorizes, it doesn't mandate. So you don't really have to do this if you don't want to or your members don't agree to it. That's for the member. The Myra will get into the consortia, which is not something that you can choose not to do. That's at a state level, but she'll get into that briefly. And then you can only reduce funds by no more than the carryover. You cannot go into the member's base, only the carryover. And that's up to you to decide how much of that carryover to reduce. So next slide, please. And then a couple of other things to remember, and I bolded it there. If the consortium makes a finding by a majority vote based on a member having excessive carryover for at least 2 consecutive fiscal years, beginning with 23-24, meaning, you know, when after Q4 is certified this year and we get into the next fiscal year of 23-24, then we start tracking this. A consortium is authorized to reduce a member's allocation by no more than the percentage of the member's carryovers. So we're going to talk a little bit about what majority vote means, what excessive carryover means, and what is the percentage of the members' carryover to be reduced. Those are some key terms that I'll unpack right now. Next slide, please. Okay, so just remember, it has to be a majority vote. Excessive carryover is determined by each consortium. So consortia. So you might have one consortia say, our excessive carryover is going to be 50%. And then you could have another consortia determine that their carryover, excessive carry is going to be 20%. And so it'll vary around the state depending on the consortium and how they determine what excessive carryover is. So there is no uniform percentage. It's up to you guys to decide. And then, of course, for the members, it has to be 2 consecutive fiscal years. And Myra's going to show you in NOVA how there are some tools that we can track or tools that we're working on so you can see, you know, who's on track to maybe get 1 consecutive year, or after this first year, who has exceeded it for the first year and might be on track to get 2 consecutive years. So we have those tools that we're building into NOVA, and she'll talk about that in a little bit. Funds may be reduced by no more than the carryover. The amount could be, you could reduce all of the carryover, or you could reduce a small percentage. It's up to you to determine the amount of the carryover to be reduced. And I have an example that I'm going to walk everybody through so you can see the kind of decisions that you'll have to make on the carryover conversation once you get into this. And then the fund reduction is for that fiscal year and does not impact base. Like I said earlier, it doesn't affect your base funding going forward. It just affects the carryover. And then, of course, the majority vote takes place once Q4 is certified. So that when those numbers get updated at the end of the second year, if you have a member that has already 1 consecutive year and you're into the second year and you certify it, and oh, they came up again, exceeding the unique excessive carryover percentage that your consortia agreed to, then you would vote to see, based on your bylaws, how much you would reduce that member's funding, the carryover. So next slide, please. Okay, just a reminder, so carryover tracking begins 23-24 fiscal year once Q4 is certified. And so as you know, members certify their Q4 on September 1st. and Consortia certifies it by the end of the month. So technically, we'd be tracking this starting after Q4 of 22-23. We track it for the full year. And then once 23-24 Q4 is certified, then we would know first who has exceeded the Consortia determined member carryover percentage for year one. And then we would also know that Myra will get into which consortia has exceeded the 20% for the initial year. And she'll explain that it's only 1 year and what goes into that decision and that process. Okay, and then the start date for tracking member carryover and consortia carryover is the same. We're going to start at the end of Q4 this year, starting with expenditures accumulating, I guess, July 1 of 2023, going to June 30th of 2024 after you certify Q4 of next year. So next slide, please.
Neil?
Yes.
There is a question in the chat before we move on from Paul, and he states, so remaining funds from 22-23 that became carryover in 23-24 are part of the year one carryover determination?
So when this is what'll happen. So when we get to Q4 next year, all active funds, so we have this year, I think it's 21-22 CAPE funds will be expiring at the end of December. So then going into Q4 next year, you'll have 22-23, 23-24. Wait, I'll have to look at that. But Paul, it's all active funds. So whatever you're carrying over from prior year or prior year would be considered in that excessive carryover. So if and I think I have an example of this, if your base funding is 1 million and you're carrying over, 50% more of 1.5 million, then that carryover of 500,000 would be subject to, whatever rules your consortia comes up with. So we would, and let's say that 500,000 is based on 400,000 from prior year and 100,000 from prior year. And so all those active funds would be considered in the excessive carryover. I don't know if I answered his question though. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. It's an aggregate carryover balance. So yeah, you did cover it, Neil.
Okay. Next slide, please. All right. So let's talk about excessive member carryover. Excessive member carryover is not defined in legislation. So like I said, each individual consortia may uniquely define excessive member carryover as a specific percentage of unspent funds from the prior year or prior year. So you'll go into NOVA and put that unique excessive member carryover percentage. And so NOVA will track each of your members to see how you're doing against that unique percentage of excessive carryover. And like I said, that'll vary from each consortium as far as what you decide that excessive carryover amount or percentage is. So this percentage becomes the consortia threshold for determining which members meet or exceed the excessive carryover. So it's up to you guys to figure that out and agree to what that amount should be. Let's see. And then each consortia defines their percentage annually starting in 23-24. So, and Myra and Veronica will go over this. When you submit your CFAD this year, because that's for 23-24, you will have to decide what your unique excessive carryover amount is. And that will be tracked through the whole year of 23-24 for all your members. So you have an option. You can say, no, we're not going to do it this year, and I'm going to rely on the state's 20%. Or we're going to say, hey, we're going to come up with our own for members, and we're going to go with 15%, or we're going to go with 30%. So it's up to you on what you decide. And yes, I do have an example coming up. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, and then just a reminder, the majority membership vote, membership as defined in Ed Code is community college district, school district, county office, or a JPA located within the boundaries of the adult education region. And then it's one vote, one member when reducing member carryover. Okay, next slide, please. And then just a little reminder on the carryover reduction amount. It says no more than the amount of the members' carryover as certified in Q4 of the previous fiscal year. The bill doesn't specify a percentage or an amount, so the consortia would, or all the consortia will have to decide how much of a reduction is appropriate based on the percentage threshold. So you might have a, excessive carryover percentage for members at 20%. And so when you get to that 20%, how much of that is going to be reduced? You might say all of it, or you might say, oh, we're only going to reduce half. Or you might say, okay, we're going to let, with some kind of plan, we're going to let the consortia keep a percentage of that, but the rest will be reallocated based on what we agreed upon. So you might want to think about what your process is and your bylaws for reallocating that. Is it going to go to consortia-wide projects? Is it going to stay in that community so we don't take the money away from the students that are being served in that community? So, is another adjacent member going to benefit from that? So all those things need to be considered when you reduce a member's carryover amount of what you're going to do with that money. And it should be upfront so everybody knows what's going to happen if a member gets their funding reduced. So next slide, please. Okay, and then as I've said before, a vote to reduce a member's carryover will affect the prior year carryover only, or prior year, not future allocations or base funding. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then just the last reminder, here's the process beginning in 23-24. Consortia will track member carryover to determine if a member has excessive carryover for at least 2 consecutive years. Excessive carryover as determined by the individual consortia would be based on certification of Q4 in NOVA. Members certify September 1st, then the consortia certifies September 30th. Members must offer members locally determined technical assistance to help prevent them from having 2 consecutive fiscal years of carryover. So that's another thing you'll have to determine. What is that technical assistance and reasonable intervention, and how far in advance did you offer it to that member before they came up with 2 consecutive years? You should be really offering that technical assistance in year 1 if they look like they're going to have at least 1 consecutive year. Maybe you can help avoid that. But then definitely in year 2, you should offer that technical assistance to avoid the 2nd consecutive year. And of course, TAP will be available to help you, as well as whatever local process you come up with. And then lastly, if the consortium determines that a member has excessive carryover for the 2 consecutive years and a reasonable intervention hasn't eliminated the carryover, then the consortium can reduce the member's carryover with the majority vote. Okay, so next slide, please.
And before we just go into the next slide, Neil, there was a question about base funding from Kelly Henwood asking, define base funding. Is it allocation from which year?
So that would be the base funding is your allocation from prior year. So let's say you got 5 million last year and the budget's good for the state, then you automatically get that 5 million. If the state decides to give you a COLA, you also get that COLA. So you can't take that away, but what you can take away is any excessive carryover from prior years. If you agree to a unique excessive carryover amount and you agree to how much of the carryover to be reduced. So that's on the consortia. So the base is that prior year funding that you automatically get that gets rebenched every year if we get a COLA. So this year we got a COLA So that would rebench our base funding. So going into next year, you'd get a higher amount, and that's safe. Can't reduce it with this carryover legislation. Did I answer that? Were there any other, because I think I have the example coming up. Were there any other questions that I needed to answer?
Yes. So earlier there was a question from Kelly Henwood asking, how about the FIFO? How will this help them? That was when they were talking about the aggregate carryover
So
balance.
Okay, so with FIFO, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, we'll get into that. It gets a little confusing with FIFO, but you'll just see which remaining active funds you have. You'll see if you have funding from prior year and funding from last year or prior year. And that will show you how much carryover potentially you could be working on throughout the year. Because the way NOVA works, it spends the oldest funds first. So if you have money that's 2 years old, any expenses you certify are going to spend down that oldest money first. So that liquidates part of your carryover. And then once you liquidate that prior year, then it starts working on the prior year, the last year. And once that's liquidated, then it starts working on current year, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So there'll be reports in NOVA that will help, help you track this. And so you can see where you're at. And they'll be, and like Myra said, they'll be available soon. Anything else before I get into the example?
Yes. So sorry, my chat just jumped on me, but there was another question about from Kishan, what happened to not more than 20% carryover that I heard before?
Okay, that was the old, I don't know, AB 104, the old CAPE before the legislation. We had targets of, 20% by Q1, 40% by Q2, 60% by Q3, and 80% by Q4, with the remaining 20% was okay to bring over. And that was before we had carryover legislation. And so with carryover legislation, it kind of still aligns that with the consortia carryover with the 20% that Myra will talk about. But as a consortium for members, you can go below that, you can go above that, and it's really up to you. So we took that out of the program guidance because we're no longer setting that target as a mandate, but we could, still use that for the consortia carryover. And that's something we're thinking about depending on the tools that we have available in NOVA. So the 20% is still pertinent for the consortia discussion. For the member discussion, that's up to you guys to determine what your excessive carryover would be.
And then Neil, that leads to Shannon Eller's question. Can we change the quote unquote excessive definition from year to year?
Yeah, I'm going to show that in your example. So you could go like this coming year in your CFAD, you're like, oh, we're not sure. We need more time. So we're going to go with 50%. And then after a year, you're feeling more comfortable. Then next year, when you're certifying your CFAD, you could go down to 15% when you feel more comfortable. So you have the ability every year when you certify your CFAD, and Veronica will show you this, you can update your excessive carryover amount. Could get a little confusing because you might have a member that exceeded year one at 25%, and then you change it for year two at 15%, and they could still exceed year two. So that would be 2 consecutive years, but it could be a little difficult to track. But I mean, not impossible. So you do have that flexibility.
Okay. You have a couple more questions in the chat, Neil.
Okay.
Susan Wynn asked, so 20% carryover applies to the consortia reporting as a whole. It is still a requirement.
Yes, the 20% for the consortia, yeah, based on the legislation.
And then Emma Diaz says, when will the fiscal management guidance be updated? What are you saying, Neil, was in the previous guide of 15% spent each quarter?
Yeah, so that was updated. And Veronica, did we post that yet? The new guidance, the updated guidance? Oh, it was emailed out yesterday. So
email and posted.
Okay. So we have the new guidance out there. We took out some of the old targets because now we have more legislative parameters, so to speak, for the consortia. Like Susan was saying, it's at 20%.
And Karima posted the link in the chat. Thank you.
And then Nikki says, so a single member could go higher than 20% as long as it does not push the consortia as a whole. I mean, you can decide whatever you want. You could say, we're not going to do a member carryover, but you still run the risk of the 20% for the whole consortia. So you might want to think about that is, are we going to run the risk of going over 20% as a consortia if we don't do anything internally for our members? Maybe you'll be okay. But you have to look at past history and spending to make that decision as a consortia of what you want to do for member carryover.
Okay. So there are a few more questions filtering in. Do you want to look at those, Neil, or would you like to move on and then maybe come back to those?
Yeah, I think Adriana's question about takeaway means reduce or reallocate. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, and so here's a reminder, some bylaws that you probably want to start considering. Agreement on percentage of member carryover that will be defined as excessive. Agreement on percentage of member carryover that will be reduced. Your decision-making majority voting process to reduce member carryover. And then what your definition of technical assistance reasonable intervention will be to help avoid a member from carryover finding, so to speak. Okay, next slide, please. So let's get into the example. I call this the Adult Ed Outside Consortium because I couldn't come up with anything better. Consortium has 5 members. They make decisions based on consensus, but if they have to, they'll use majority vote. So next month in April, the consortium has a public meeting and they decide on the consortium, their excessive carryover percentage. They make a decision on the percentage to be reduced if a member has 2 consecutive years of carryover. They agree upon the technical assistance process, and they agree to when the carryover updates will happen. They'll happen on a quarterly basis. And then, of course, they agree to add these bylaw updates. So let's go to the next slide for the next month. Oh, and then so they also decided that excessive carryover percentage will be 20%. And so that's a bylaw. And they'll set up their spending targets as such. Q1 will be 10%, Q2 40%, Q3 60%, Q4 80%, leaving that 20% as the excessive carryover. So you can have up to 20% of excessive carryover. So each quarter they will look at their spending rate to see how they're doing so they can get to that 80% or more. And so they don't, hit that excessive carryover for year 1. Next slide, please. So after all those decisions, they also agree that the members with 2 consecutive years of carryover will be 100%. So they're taking all the carryover. But they had a caveat saying of that carryover that we're taking, the 100%, 75% of the member carryover will be reallocated based on the 3-year plan and member approval. And then the other 25% may be retained by the member that's being reduced if their carryover plan has been approved by the consortium members. So they're giving that member an opportunity to take some back based on a plan that they come forward with. So they're getting a little creative here. They're coming up with maybe, a way for that member maybe to plead their case. And if it gets passed by the consortium members, then it would be retained. Now, you could also have your own bylaws that state, we might have a member that's going to refurbish a building or they're saving money to do a retrofit. And so they're going to be over the 20% or they're going to be over whatever the excessive carryover definition is. So then you would be okay with that because everybody agreed to that. And so they wouldn't get that money taken away. So those are the kind of things you have to consider when you're drafting your bylaws and figuring out this excessive member carryover, because there might be certain projects that might take a long time that you would have to agree upon, like, we're okay with this, that we wouldn't vote to reduce their funding because we're okay. Also, this could come up in the majority vote. Some members would say, hey, I thought we already agreed that this member was going to do this building retrofit, so I agree not to take the money away. I mean, you could have it happen like that, or there could be an agreement in advance. So it's really up to you of what you want to put in your bylaws that govern this, because it's really your decision on making that excessive carryover amount and that excessive carryover decision. Okay, so next slide, please.
Neil, there's a quick question from John Werner. Do we have any bylaw template language for each of these concepts?
Not yet, but I think we're going to have a webinar about it, aren't we? Sometime later this year.
Yeah, we are working on putting out a series of webinar trainings. I think one is going to touch on the bylaws, and then also an additional one, probably around May or so, that will actually focus on the tools that the consortia and the members will be able to use to track the monitoring of this carryover.
All right. Okay, so moving right along into May, so this is when you certify your CFAD. You're also going to be certifying your excessive carryover percentage for the next year. And so I think Myra and Veronica will show you how that happens in NOVA. But then we get into September, we're certifying Q4 for this year, and that will kick off after you certify Q4, then it'll start tracking your expenses for 23-24, which means that'll be when the carryover clock starts ticking. So on December 1st, 2023, members submit their Q1 for 23-24, the consortium certifies. So then by Q1, you'll kind of know those first reportable expenses that will go against the carryover amount. And you can kind of start seeing, who has a lot of carryover. You might already know that, but that could kick off, kind of the carryover season or cycle. Next slide, please. So then after Q1 and Q2, consortia and their members review how each member's progressing towards their spending targets. If members are falling short, then the agreed upon falling short of the agreed upon spending target, then technical assistance can be offered. After Q3, if technical assistance isn't working, you might start having discussions about allocation amendments or more technical assistance to avoid excessive carryover findings. So all that could be happening, by Q3. Next slide, please. And then right around that same time in May of 2024, you have to certify the CFAD for 24-25, and you might want to update your consortia excessive carryover percentage. And in this case, this consortia decided to go from 20% down to 15%. And so year one was 20%, year two is 15%. Okay, and so then we get to Q4, and the consortia and members certify, and members that exceeded the consortia upon 20% from 23-24 are highlighted in NOVA. NOVA will automatically highlight them as exceeding one or more consecutive years. So next slide, please. And then throughout the next year, 24-25, you're going through the same process, monitoring quarterly expenditure reports, providing technical assistance. By Q2 or Q3, you're having those discussions about allocation amendments as a possible option to forego those members that are having excessive carryover, maybe for 1 year, because maybe they're looking at having carryover, excessive carryover for 24-25, or you have those members that in 23-24 had excessive carryover, and they're still, with all that technical assistance and discussion, still on track to have excessive carryover in 24-25. So there could be discussions then maybe moving money around. So you don't want to go to that vote. Maybe you come up with an agreed upon plan. So it's really, flexible as far as how you want to deal with this. And then lastly, once consortium members certify Q4, members with 2 consecutive years will be voted on by consortium members for possible funding reduction. So I think next slide, please. I think there's just, voting results, majority vote. Consortium must follow the carryover bylaws on how much to be reduced. Consortium will certify in NOVA the reduction via the allocation amendment. CAPE funds will be transferred to reflect the reduction in NOVA. So if you are doing allocation amendments, if you're direct funded, you will have to physically move that money around because NOVA does not move the money around. It's just a tracking system dashboard. And so if you had a fiscal agent, they could do that. But if you're direct funded, you'd have to work that out at the local level of moving money from one account to another for an allocation amendment. Okay, and I think I have one more slide. And here are some takeaways. Just please be clear on your governance, on how you plan to implement this legislation. Track members and assess annually and often, maybe quarterly, offer interventions, vote on possible one-time carryover reductions or allocation amendments before it gets to a carryover vote. You'll have to fill in the gaps on how much to be reduced, the voting process, those check-ins, what's that timetable look like, and how to utilize any reallocated carryover funds. Where's that going? Who gets it? Does it stay in the local area? That kind of thing. And then, of course, members can use tools in NOVA and technical assistance from TAP as they become available. And then lastly, there are some risks by doing nothing. So if you choose not to participate, then you still have to monitor your 20% carryover and see that you don't exceed that. And that's after the first year. And Myra's going to go into that a little bit. So with that, I will dive into the chat while I turn this over to Myra. I think this is my last slide. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. So we're going to turn it over to start talking about the second tier level of monitoring that will be occurring, which is the consortia carryover. So as we get ready to transition and talk about the impact on consortium carryover, just wanted to highlight the objective to this member carryover conversation, and really want to ensure that each member is ultimately spending down the CAPE funds that they're entitled to serve the students in their programs and their respective regions. Also that the consortia work with its members by providing technical support as a first level of intervention to ensure they're addressing that excessive member carryover. So we'll transition. Next slide, please. So AB 1491 for the consortium, and what that means is AB 1491 requires a consortium with carryover from one or more prior fiscal years exceeding the 20% carryover to submit a written expenditure plan to the chancellor and the superintendent. What will follow is the prescribing and assigning of technical assistance to that consortium to ensure that adequate adult education services are provided to the region in proportion to the region's available funding. So this is where the 20% is actually called out, and it will be at the consortia level. So really the consortia would want to work with its members to ensure that carryover at the member level is closely monitored and spent down. Otherwise, the consortia will be flagged by the chancellor and the superintendent, and those additional steps that we will outline further will follow. Next slide, please. So some key terms that we'll be talking about in regards to consortia carryover, the start date, it should align with the member carryover start date, how we're calculating the 20% carryover, what is the written expenditure plan, and the technical assistance that will follow, and what will be the consortia carryover reduction process. Next slide, please. So the start date for consortia carryover aligns with the member carryover tracking. So this is going to begin in program year 23-24, and that is once Q4 is certified. So the start date is for tracking member carryover and the consortia carryover. And that will be in 23-24. So I know there's a lot of questions in the chat and concerns in the chat, and that's where what we're going to be able to present to you today with what is currently available in NOVA. Just rest assured that we're working to try and meet those, timelines that you're working on as well. But since we know that as far as the tracking and those tools, that is where we were able to actually start this in 23-24 as opposed to 22-23. So next slide, please. So calculating the 20% consortia carryover. The consortia carryover is one or more prior fiscal years exceeding 20%, and this is assessed and acted upon annually. So the distinction to this, as opposed to what was addressed in prior slides on the member carryover, is that for the consortia, we will actually be looking at this on an annual basis. And it is once the consortia reaches that 20% threshold carryover, that consortia will be flagged. There are tools that are going to be in place in NOVA to capture this. And that is where it is important that the consortia is monitoring the member carryover and that the members are focusing as well on their own carryover, because ultimately, if that carryover continues and it's not on a 2-year basis, but rather on an annual basis, that will flag the consortia to reach that 20% carryover, which will then be looked at by the state. Next slide, please. So here is an example of the consortia carryover. So if a consortia receives $8 million a year with 4 members, and each member per se is receiving $2 million a year for a total of $8 million. When Q4 is certified in NOVA, the consortium had $2 million in carryover, or about 25%. So if you divide the $2 million by $8 million, the carryover was made up of each member having at least $500K in carryover, and each member had a 25% carryover. So this would cause the consortia to fall within the exceeded 20% carryover threshold for the consortia and will be flagged according to AB 1491 legislation. Next slide, please. So what will happen once a consortia is flagged on an annual basis is in NOVA, the consortia will be prompted to complete a written expenditure plan. And so that written expenditure plan will populate in NOVA, and we will provide additional training to cover more in depth what that will look like as the programmers are working to include the expenditure plan in NOVA. And of course, as always, we'll make sure to provide guidance and training on how to go about completing this written expenditure plan. This will allow the state to track the progress of the expenditure plan. So keep that in mind, that once that the consortia gets flagged, they will be required to complete this written expenditure plan, and then the state will be monitoring the progress based on the plan that the consortia has outlined to reduce the carryover percentage threshold. Next slide, please. An additional item that will occur is the technical assistance. So at the consortia level, first step is if the consortia has carryover, it will flag the system in NOVA, and a written expenditure plan will populate for the consortia to complete, and the members will sign off on that, that written expenditure plan. And then the second aspect to this is the technical assistance. So the state will work with our Cape TAP to assign technical assistance to those consortia to ensure that there is, the effective use of funds is being carried out as specified by policy and legislation. Ultimately, our focus is to ensure that the consortia annual carryover does not continue to exceed the 20% threshold, so that it continues to provide the adequate adult education services to the region. There will be additional details on the technical assistance and the state level that will occur to review and ensure adequate services related to funding are taking place. As we mentioned, just want to highlight this actual tracking will occur in fiscal year 23-24. So the technical assistance for the consortia carryover and the written expenditure plan, we won't see that kick in until we're talking about 2024. Next slide, please. Consortia carryover summary. So just to summarize the carryover aspect for the consortia, this is going to start in 23-24. The state is going to track consortia carryover to determine if any consortia is exceeding that 20% carryover from one or more prior fiscal years. And then the consortia carryover is based on certification of Q4 and NOVA by September 30. I want to say maybe Neil may have highlighted this, but one of the key aspects that we really want to make sure we point out is that Q4 certification period is going to be highly critical. So this goes for the members to really try and reach those Q4 certification, because that is where we will look at, you know, once that Q4 is certified, that is how we're looking at what is that carryover balance. And so trying to meet those deadlines at the member level certification, at the consortia level, and making sure that those Q4 reports are certified in a timely manner will be very critical as we are running reports and looking at those carryover balances. And rest assured, we're working very diligently to ensure that we are incorporating tools in NOVA that will be user-friendly for the members to review, to track, and then the consortia, and we will be providing additional training. Next slide, please. So an additional consortia carryover summary. Consortia with 20% or more carryover will be required to submit the written expenditure plan to the state, in which they will outline how the consortia will work to reduce the carryover below the 20% threshold. And the state will assign technical assistance to those consortia to ensure that there is, you know, the effective use of funds and that they don't continue to carry over that 20%. This is the second tier level of monitoring that will occur. It is the first tier where the members should really focus on, you know, spending down those funds, eliminating as best possible that carryover balance, because the state will not reallocate any of those funds, but at the consortia level, the legislation allows for that. So you really want to, within your own institution, really focus on spending down those funds as they are supposed to be spent according to your plans, and what the intent of it is to be providing adequate adult education services to your region. Otherwise, these carryover flags, you know, are going to come into place, and that is where at the consortia level, and then as well at the state level, these various tier systems will be flagged and put in place. Next slide, please. So AB 1491 for the consortia takeaways. As we've been reiterating, a member carryover impacts consortia carryover. So really this message should be for the members to really focus on spending down that carryover, looking at when you're certifying those quarterly 4 reports, because that will be very critical. And when we're looking at that carryover balance, if member carryover is managed, then the consortia carryover would be under the 20%. And then 23-24 is when this is going to go into effect. And Q4, once again, that is going to be a very critical time period. So ensuring that members are certifying and the consortia is also certifying before or within that timeline. Anything later than that is going to potentially create some challenges and issues, which we'll address, you know, as we get to those points in time. And as a result, AB 1491 authorizes it authorizes a consortium to reduce a member's excessive carryover funding. So as long as it is consistent with the same aspects, which is the member no longer wishes to provide services that are consistent with the adult education plan. That's one of the options in which the consortia can reduce a member's funding. Number 2, if the member cannot provide services that address the needs identified in the adult education plan. And number 3, if the member has been ineffective and providing services that address the needs identified in the adult education plan. And this added language to AB 1491, the changes to this ed code include having that excessive carryover for at least 2 consecutive fiscal years. And this will begin in 23-24 fiscal year and each fiscal year thereafter. And if reasonable interventions have not resulted in improvements. Next slide, please. As we've been talking, tools and resources in NOVA. So we are working very diligently to have these tools updated. And we will plan on having a webinar with our CAPE-TAP partners to ensure that we are able to walk through what are the tools. If just presenting on this new legislation and guidance is confusing, we know what will come when we release those NOVA tools. So we want to make sure that we walk with you in this rollout of tools that will be available in NOVA. So keep an eye out for that. We are looking at the forecasting tool, an expenditure threshold percentage tool, a corrective action flag. We're looking at that, which will be at the member level. And it's going to be very closely aligned to what we have outlined in the guidance. So the tools that are being rolled out will align with what we have outlined in the guidance. The CFAD, as you may have already know, has already been updated as well. Question number 16 and number 17. And I'll actually take an opportunity right now. I know there were some questions that were brought up earlier. So I did want to highlight, I know we were looking in our system and there was one member or one consortia who was ahead of the game and was able to get their CFAD already submitted. And so we are going to be working with that CFAD because the one additional tool that is not yet available, but will soon be by the end of this week, is going to be this carryover threshold percentage. And then we will have Veronica, there is a slide in which you'll get to see what that's going to look like in the upcoming slides. But just know that the CFAD that has been aligned with this AB 1491 legislation, there are 3 aspects. So question number 16, question number 17 has been updated, and there is one additional tool that is not there yet today, but will be by the end of the week. So we do want to kindly ask to hold off on submitting the CFAD as we work to get that in place. We will send out communication once that has been updated. And we do have a mock-up slide to show you what that will look like and be able to walk you through. We know that the deadline for this CFAD is quickly approaching on May 2nd. And so we would like for you to hold off on submitting this, especially as we are, providing additional guidance, these tools, and providing clarification on the rollout of this AB 1491 and how that applies and impacts the CFAD. Annual plan question on carryover, where we've updated actually the fiscal management, and we are working to implement reports for carryover at the member level. So rest assured, because we know there is this 2-tier level of monitoring or tracking that will be occurring, we are working with our programmers to ensure that we are incorporating tools at the member level and flags. You will see, what we've updated to ensure that the members can identify the carryover, that the consortia can identify the carryover, and then the reports that they can run to be able to track this carryover at the consortia for the members and so forth. So we will be providing additional details and having a presentation specifically on this to walk you through those tools. Next slide, please. We are also working on consortia onboarding, governance, administrative functions. So we are working closely with our TAP to try and roll out a series of professional development trainings. We understand the concern about the CFAD and the deadline that is quickly approaching and the training on governance, bylaws. So we will revisit this professional development series timeline that we have to ensure that we are able to align with, what the field is working on and the deadlines that they are working on. So appreciate the feedback that you guys are providing and the concerns so that we can take that back and work together to try and support you all as you're trying to complete the CFAT in a timely manner. Targeted technical assistance will also be incorporated. NOVA workshops and technical assistance will all be made available. Next slide, please. Whenever we released the guidance, what was that, back in early March, we were able to also incorporate a timeline to help you all in understanding the rollout of this legislation. And so in the memo, there is a link to an FAQ, there is a link to a timeline, and we understand that, this legislation has a big impact and it's going to take time to adapt. New things will arise. And so we are open to, collecting all that feedback and input as we get ready to roll this out. And we will work with you all to ensure. We know that there might be some challenges and bumps along the way, but we will work together to get this sorted out. And we're hoping that the timeline that we've included should help in understanding how this is going to be tracked. On a year-to-year basis at the consortia level, and then on a biannual basis at the member level. Next slide, please. All right, I will hand it over to Veronica.
All right, thank you, Myra. I will keep my camera off so that I can make sure I have enough bandwidth. But right now I'm going to go over to NOVA so that we can look at the CFAD as well as the additional questions as part of the governance section. And we'll come back to the PowerPoint so that we can look at the tool that is not yet available in NOVA. So here we are. Okay, 1 second. All right, so now everyone should be looking at NOVA. I am on the CFAD for Butte Glen Adult Education Consortium. Does everyone see that?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So this is the CFAD, and so you would access this by going over to consortia and members, and then clicking on the consortium and scrolling down to the CFAD section. The CFAD for 23-24 is the first item in the CFAD section. So you'll click on this link here and the CFAD will appear. The first section in the workflow for the CFAD is the fiscal declaration. So this is your disbursement method. This is the one opportunity within the program year that you will be able to change your disbursement method. So this question asks you if you want to keep the current disbursement method, or do you plan to continue, do you plan to continue with this selection for 23-24, or do you want to change it? The two disbursement methods are direct funded, which means the money from the state is sent directly to all agencies within the consortium, or is there a fiscal agent who the money is received by this particular agency and the agency disperses the money to all agencies within the consortium. So this particular consortium has chosen, they are a fiscal agent, and they will decide whether or not they will continue as a fiscal agent for the 23-24 program year. And so I will not click on or enter in any information. I am on the live site and do not want to mess up anyone's CFAD. So we're going to show, but I'm not going to enter in any data. So member agencies and certifiers. So here is a list of all of the member agencies and certifiers within this particular consortium. And so this section gives you the opportunity to, if an agency has left the consortium, has completely closed out all funding, has reported all expenditure reports, so on and so forth, you do have the opportunity at this particular time to delete this agency from the consortium. You can add additional certifiers for any agency within the consortium. You can remove particular individuals. So let's say, for example, Jennifer is no longer with the Butte County Office of Education. You can remove this particular member. You can also determine if a member within the consortium is not allocated voting member only. And so what this means is this particular member does not receive any CAP funds, but are only a voting member, which means they vote on consortium related decisions, but are not funded. And so here's your opportunity to indicate if they are a non-allocated voting member only. So that's for all of your agencies. You also have the opportunity, let's say, for example, starting this program year, there is a new adult school that has just recently been formed. You're able to add an additional agency at this time, and you would go through the steps of adding at least one member representative, inviting them to know if they do not already have a login, or if they already have a login or an account, then you would just add them as a member representative. So that's your agency and certifiers. Then here is your member allocation. So all of the consortia, all 71 CAP consortia, their 23-24 allocations have been added to NOVA. So as you can see here are all of the member names. Excuse me, here are all of the total CAP funds and total remaining funds. And the goal here is to allocate the baseline funding for each of the members, remembering that no member receives less than they received last year. And you want to make sure that your total allocated to members equals the total CAP funds, and your total remaining is 0. And just FYI, because I know there are some individuals who will come to this section and see these red total remaining from prior years. And just keep in mind that for the last 2 program years, once we have certified the CFAD and as part of the governor's May revise, we have received increase in total CAP funds. So each consortium received an increase in their total allocation for the year. And so because we cannot change the CFAD once it's certified, you have a remaining balance here, but you took care of that remaining balance and allocated the remaining balance to all members via the allocation amendment process. So for example, if let's say come the governor's May revise, there is an increase in allocation, it will be the same thing where you'll see the increase on the CFAD, but you'll complete an allocation amendment to ensure that all members receive the increase as part of the May revise. But you will see a total remaining here, but by the May 2nd deadline, your total remaining should be 0. And then I'm going to go over to the governance section. So here is the governance section. These are the questions that each consortium has to answer as part of the CFAD process. All of the questions have remained the same with the exception of questions 16 and 17. So I will scroll down to questions 16 and 17. So that everyone can see the new questions. So the first one is, what is the consortium defined excessive member carryover percentage threshold? And then it gives you some guidance text. So AB 1491 authorized a consortium to reduce a member's allocation by no more than the amount of the member's carryover if the member has excessive carryover for at least 2 consecutive fiscal years beginning with the 23-24 fiscal year. Please note there is no percentage threshold mandated in AB 1491 that is specific to member carryover. As a result, individual consortia are able to define excessive as a specific percentage of any unspent funds from the prior fiscal year. And then question 17 is, please explain how the consortium will monitor and administer carryover funds. What is the consortium's technical assistance and reasonable intervention process? What additional bylaws do you have that govern carryover? In the guidance text, if 1 year of carryover is determined, the consortium must offer members technical assistance to help prevent them from having 2 consecutive fiscal years of carryover funds. And the other questions were from prior years. Remember, all questions need to be filled out. You have up to 2,500 characters for each of these questions. And each question has to be completed. So now I'm going to go back over to the PowerPoint and show you the excessive tool that is not yet available in NOVA, but will be by the end of this week. But we have at least a mock-up of it that we'll be able to show you at this time.
quick question.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Veronica. So what you were just showing it's not live yet, Nova, right?
Yes, what I just showed is live. I was actually on the website in Nova. So the each section is live. There's just this one last section that is not yet live, but will be by the end of this week. So we go to the next slide or the next, oh, excuse me, let's scroll through each of these slides. This is what I just presented on. All right, right here. Oh, go back. One slide. Okay, so here is the carryover, the member carryover threshold. So this is where each consortium will input a unique excessive carryover percentage that applies to the members of your consortium. And we provide guidance text here as well. And so you see this button here that says carryover threshold and it's turned blue with on. That means that this particular consortium has identified a 25% carryover threshold. Now, I've been monitoring the chat and it has been stated that, you know, starting this year or even any years, you don't have to identify the carryover threshold. So if that's the case, then this button here, and hopefully you can see my cursor, but you would click this button to the left and it'll be off. And so you will not have to enter in a percentage in this particular box. In theory, you just press it, it's off, and then you move on to the next section of the governance. If the consortium has determined for this particular year that you are not going to identify a unique excessive carryover percentage for each of your members. All right, and then once you have done that, we'll go back to Nova.
Veronica, can I add a few things on this slide?
Yes, go ahead.
So just to kind of reiterate what Veronica was saying, question number 16 and 17 on the CFAD is live. This percentage threshold member carryover tool is not yet made available as of today, but our programmers are working on getting this up and running no later than the end of this week, fingers crossed. But we will be in communication with you all, and this is where we hope you hold off. I know there's one member that for one consortia that has certified. There's one close to that state and point. So we're hoping that you guys can hold off at least by the end of this week. This will be made available. And this is supposed to be what captures if the consortia votes and decides that they want to implement a carryover percentage threshold, they will indicate the percentage on here. It is a part of the CFAD, which means this could be revisited on an annual basis. If you choose 25% today, next year it's the CFAD, you'll complete it again and you'll get to decide, or the members will get to vote and decide what percentage will be indicated, and NOVA will be set up to track that carryover and be able to flag that.
All right, so we'll go back to the NOVA screen, and we just have the preview section here. So in theory, the carryover threshold is a part of this. It's in between the member allocation and the governance, and you've completed your governance, and now you're going to go to your preview screen. And so you'll be able to preview all that has been filled out. So all of the sections, including the member allocations, the agencies and certifiers, the governance section. We also have the certification and assurances. And so making sure that everyone reviews these prior to approving the CFAD, and then you would submit. So here is your submit button here. Now, if any of these sections are not complete, then you will not be able to submit. But once you submit, all of the members of the consortium will be notified. They will review everything that has been inputted, and they will either approve or reject the CFAD. So that is the CFAD in a nutshell. Are there any questions specific to what I have just shown? I'll go to the chat. I believe Neil may have been keeping up with them. Neil and everyone else.
I guess, do we have time now to answer that? I've been responding to the chat and Myra was too, but I guess we could answer. We have time to answer questions, right?
Yes, absolutely. There are 18 more minutes.
Okay, so I think the one that we didn't answer, Janae, we just wanted to say on the direct funded, the only time the state gets involved with direct funded allocations is if there's a trailer bill or a May revised change. We're hoping that won't happen. And so that would mean your CFAD allocations that you certify would be the same ones that the state would put in the payment schedules that go out in July and August and throughout the rest of the year. So we'll just wait and see to see if there's a May revised change or a trailer bill change in June. If not, we should be good. Okay, and then Adriana says, what if we want to set different percentages of carryover for each member, not the same percentage for all members? Well, you can't do that. Myra, we can't, it's impossible to do that, right?
I'm sorry, what was the question? Can you repeat it?
They want to set different percentages, the excessive carryover for each member. It has to be for the consortia and their members, right?
No, unfortunately not. It's in the CFAD, that tool that we showed, that is where, you know, having these meetings with your members, these public meetings, having these conversations is going to be very critical to ensure that you guys can agree on a percentage or the option to opt out. But it will be one input in the CFAD. All members will agree and sign off on that.
And Myra, do you know how NOVA is going to calculate the percentage? So what would be excessive? Would it be anything over the 20%? So 20.1 versus someone saying, is it 20%? If I put in 20%, is it 21%? Or is it anything over the 20%? And maybe that's putting you on the spot. I don't know how it's calculated. I would assume it's anything over the 20%.
Right. I know I saw Jeff on here. I don't know if he's still here and is able to answer that. I know we've been focused on the 20% logistics, but that fine point percent, not right. But I will make sure that we have that information.
I'm here, Myra. It's entirely up to
hi, Jeff. Are you?
It's entirely up to what you want. If you want it equal to or greater than, we can do that. If you want it greater than only, we can do that as well.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So yeah, we'll make sure that we provide some clarity on what that exact percentage, when that will be flagged and kick in.
Okay. So what are we hedging towards? Greater than or too early to tell?
At this point, it's too early to tell, but I think we can probably discuss it in further. I mean, hopefully, overall, try and spend down your funds. I think that's our message for today is spend down your funds. We don't want to, deal with this either. So if as much as a difficult headache this is going to be for you all, we want to make sure that ultimately you're spending down your funds. However, there's these flags and measures in place that will flag and trigger, and we're going to get to the nitty gritty of these percentages if it gets to that point.
Okay, I'm looking, let's see if there's, so no. Kim says one member may have construction or other things that the other member doesn't, making carryover percentage needs different. So then I would just say, Kim, so you should put in your bylaws what the carryover means, what your allowances are. If you agree that there's a retrofit or a renovation or a big marketing campaign or something that you're saving money for, then, that's up to you how you want to implement that, how you want to allow a member to carry things forward. The same goes, to the 20% for the state. If we get a plan, written expenditure plan from you saying, hey, we have 3 members that are putting in retrofits on buildings and we put this money aside, I think we're going to be reasonable with that and say, oh, that sounds good. Keep us abreast of that situation. Hopefully you spend down the money. Those kind of things are on a case-by-case basis. So you can consider that for the member carryover, and we'll consider that at the state for the 20% as well, if that makes sense. And then Karima says, if consortia hasn't defined excessive carryover yet, then it can turn off the carryover threshold on the CFAT for 23 in NOVA. Is that correct? Yeah, yes, Karima. And Corley had a similar question, advantages or disadvantages. I guess, you know, the advantage is if you turn it off, it gives you time to let this sink in, review your bylaws, have those public meetings, have some discussion. The downside is if you ignore your carryover, you could exceed that 20%, and then you would have to work with the state on the written plan and all that goes along with that. So maybe keep an eye on the consortia carryover while you're working through your issues with your member carryover, something like that. And Adrian suggests greater than, and so does Rosa and everybody else. Thanks for the feedback. Ivan suggests I would make it consistent with language for consortia carryover, which I believe is greater than. Okay, thank you, Ivan. Is encumbrance, no, expenditures are expenditures, sorry. You can't count encumbrances. Yeah, my video's off because I'm having some technical difficulties. Sorry, I'll try to go with it. I don't know, Myra, if you want to take over. I'm at Susan just had I think a comment, like a tip.
Susan. Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
Oh no, I thought you were also having problems. I was going to read it, but I'll allow you to.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. There's a lot of questions coming in, so trying to keep track of that.
Okay. Well, I think I found it then. So Susan Nguyen states in the chat, regarding the consortium member carryover threshold, the legislation does not mandate a reallocation of up to the carryover amount after 2 years of excessive carryover as defined by the consortium members, and will have to receive majority member approval to occur. Nothing could happen to. Maybe Susan, you want to come off mute?
Sure. It was just clarification, a clarification point, as in, you know, it's even if a consortium member had greater than, it doesn't had carryover greater than, or defined as excessive carryover greater than the threshold its consortia had voted on in its bylaws and everything to set. It could also, the members could also still vote to not do anything about that. It could just say, yep, and these are the circumstances of why this occurred. And so, yeah, okay, we're not going to do anything about that. So, I mean, that's also a possibility. It's not a mandate that funding would, of any amount, would have to be reallocated.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, Susan. Thank you for making that comment. And I'm trying to go down the list. What would be the next question?
I think we're okay. Emma just commented on Kim's example where she has one member that receives a lot of money and another member that might not receive as much. So there's variation in funding amounts, and you have to consider that on, you know, when you're making excessive carryover decisions and stuff like that. And then Michelle. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think that's where, I mean, the way that the legislation has it, we try to keep it very consistent with that, where 1% on the member level, if they choose to, we try to make it as consistent and as easy as possible for the members to be able to make that decision at the local level. And knowing that there's going to be a lot of, you know, special circumstance situations that may arise out of that, but that's also where there's that option to opt out feature that we try to incorporate in NOVA as well. So, you know, we're doing as best as we can to ensure that we're following the legislation as closely as possible, while also aligning our tools and systems that we use to monitor and track that to align as closely as possible as well.
Right. And and Michelle's question about, what do we put in question 16 if we choose not to define? And I was just saying, describe the process that you went through or why you made that decision, just to give us a little background, because you have to put something in there. And then I'm trying to understand Eileen's question. Can a member approved through carryover explanation be placed in the carryover?
Hi, Neil.
Hi, Eileen. What do you
Don't type
mean?
and answer an email at the same time. Sorry about that. I was saying that if we have a member that's going to roll over and the consortium members vote, majority vote, that they can roll over this amount of money for a special event. So like the server fried something and we got to get a new server. Can that be placed in the carryover dialog box? I mean, wouldn't that be the easiest way to transfer this information?
Yeah, if you want to tell in the governance document, you want to explain how you're handling your carryover, you could explain whatever agreements you have at the local level for dealing with carryover. That would be appropriate. So then we know at the state level, what's the and what you agreed to.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, Neil, if this was going on, if we put it in there and we had the green go for the in the carryover box, it would explain to them, don't track this person, we're using this money for blah, blah. That's what I was really saying. I will put it in the governance, but I also wanted to know, could we stop the tracking system on the consortium if we're moving money around or letting them hold it?
Yeah, I mean, you could still have the tracking going on if you want, if you do decide on an excessive carryover amount, or you could turn it off. It just depends on how you want to track that, because Nova will track whatever percentage you put in there.
Okay, because I was just thinking it would be a great way for you guys to know what our consortium is doing and be on the up and up through the whole thing. But if it's turning it off and letting it track us for a year, I'm fine with that too. I do a pretty good job of tracking them.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, Neil. Sorry about the text.
That's all right.
Two things at once. Bye-bye.
Okay, and then this is an interesting one. Adrian says, can we set different percentage by member in the bylaws and keep Nova turned off? I was just thinking of that. Legislation says that you have to define excessive carryover. It doesn't really say that it has to be uniformly. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I don't know. Myra, any thoughts on that? If you're looking at the same question I am?
I think I would just go back to what the legislation states. And the legislation really just focused on the 20%, clearly calling that out at the carryover or the consortia level. So we focused on that. And then at the member level, it's, we set up a tool. So there's really a lot of local decisions, and the way that we've been able to align the guidance and Nova is really just to mirror, what are within the parameters of this legislation. So getting into those technicalities, the system might not capture that. So I don't know that I would necessarily advise that. We are working to set up Nova to be able to track based on, what we've identified in this presentation, which is the consortia. There will be that flag, the written expenditure plan will populate, the technical assistance will be assigned. Whereas at the member level, from a Nova standpoint, the tools to track that carryover, it could get complicated. If you're trying to set individual percentages tracking, you might run into situations where you're not tracking your members' accurate carryover level. So I would really caution that. And that's where the options that we've set forth are in line with what is in the legislation, which is if the consortium meets and decides we're going to establish a carryover percentage threshold, NOVA is set up, it's in your CFED, you'll be able to enter whatever percentage the members have voted on. If they choose not to, that is the opt-out option. And the tools that will be made available to track that carryover are in line with the percentage that gets entered or not. And so I would really caution that. Otherwise, you're going to get into situations where you're tracking carryover and different percentages, and that might not be accurately reflected.
Can I comment really quick? So to the points made earlier, in real life, we don't receive the same amount. So if the member who receives the most, which many of the consortia have one that receives the bulk of the amount, their contribution to the 20, so I'm a statistician. We can do weighted percentages, how much each of us needs to not exceed in order for the overall 20%. And the member with the highest amount, theirs would be 10, because if they get to 20 and each of us gets to 20, their 20 is a much bigger portion. So realistically, I don't think this helps. I would just say it. And I think we realistically, formulaically, we can work out what the weighted percentage needs to be for each of us, such that as a consortium, we don't exceed 20%. And that's much more palatable than setting one percentage for each member. And I really don't think the legislation requires the same percentage for each individual member. I don't think that at all.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're members and you have this discussion and you agree upon, you know, based on your interpretation of the legislation and you can move this forward, you can pretty much decide how you want to handle this. It's just unfortunate that we don't have tools in our NOVA system that help you track that. So it might, like Myra was saying, it might be difficult, but it's not against any rules doing what you're doing. It's just, you might have to do some extra work on your own to track that, to make sure that you're not exceeding your locally determined excessive carryover for each member.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's where, I mean, we understand that there are, you know, there's going to be those, like I said, those special circumstances, situations where there's also consortia that, you know, have two members, and how do they get a majority vote? So unfortunately, this legislation, you know, we're working with what we can and we're rolling it out as best as we can. But also we know that we might revisit next year and, you know, capture whatever additional guidance or clarity that we need to provide. We will work with you all, you know, listen to all the feedback, what's working, what's not working, and see how we can best try to align in those situations. And so as far as the tools that we could provide and how we capture that, there's certain things that we are able to provide guidance on. And that's where, you know, we did our best to try and capture that, where there's the member level, the consortia level, and really it's up to those conversations that are going to be happening in those meetings on how you guys are going to decide to track. And that's where we felt it was best to, you know, and to provide a tool in which you can decide 1%, you can decide 5%, you can decide 10%, whatever percentage the members vote to incorporate. That is completely left up to you all, or you can choose to opt out. And so, but as far as the tracking of that carryover, we, you know, are trying to work as best as possible to ensure that when the members in the consortia are looking at those balances and are trying to determine, you know, once you're at that point where, okay, it's flagged, what is the amount? How are we monitoring that? We want to ensure that you're looking at the right amounts. And the other key thing that we keep mentioning is really focusing on that quarterly for, ensuring that that gets submitted in a timely manner, because that can have an impact to what balance are we actually looking at? Are we looking at, you know, the actual carryover? Are we looking at when the Q4 certification took place? And so that's going to be another critical component to all of this.
Okay, so I know that we have a few more chats that are going on. It looks like there are some thank yous in there. Really want to say thank you to Myra, Neil, and Veronica for your presentation today. I know that there were multiple requests for the PowerPoint, so we are going to work on that and getting that out to you as soon as possible. Looking to have that done by tomorrow. And then we'll also make sure that we get this video sent off for remediation, and we'll share that out with you. So look for a direct email with the PowerPoint presentation, as well as an update as to when the recording will be made available. Excuse me. And thank you again to all of the attendees that stayed with us this afternoon. We have added the registration link for the remaining webinars in this series via the chat. So we encourage you to please go ahead and grab those, as well as the evaluation link. So please take a moment to not only register, but also provide an evaluation which informs our presenters and our staff on how we move forward with professional development. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye. Adios.